In terms of Marx's theoretical development and his overall orientation, the mid-1840s is the point of no return. Until that date, he was mostly interested in philosophical and historical matters. As a secondary area, he was also interested in law. Marx said that he first encountered, in his own words, the difficult obligation to write on the so-called material interest in 1842-43. Then he was the chief editor of the Rheinische Zeitung. As a matter of fact, the polemics carried out later in the same newspaper were often forced Marx to deal with economic problems. Progressively clarifying his theoretical perspective, Marx eventually came to a conclusion. Let me again directly quote him. He said, "The roots of state forms, legal relations, can be found in the conditions of material existence, namely in civil society." And he continued, also added that the analysis of civil society, however, must be sought in political economy itself. His more focused studies on political economy later restarted in Paris in 1845, continued in Brussels, and eventually again, in his own words, the general conclusion that guided his further studies was reached in 1846. This is what we mean by identifying the mid-1840s as the point of no return. Marx's arrival at this general conclusion guided his and Engels's theoretical and political work from that period on. What is this general conclusion? Simply put, it is the view that society's transformations in history can only be understood with a materialist perspective. These dates and conclusions I mentioned so far are directly extracted from the preface of the contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. And this is the book, generally considered as the first version of Capital, published in 1859. Although Marx said that his initial interest in economic issues began in 1842, it is more appropriate, I think, to date his serious dedication to economic matters and political economy as 1844 through 1846. It is in this period that German ideology was written with Engels, but not published during their lifetime. Marx also referred to general conclusion I mentioned earlier as our way of thinking, meaning his and Engels' way of thinking. He pointed out that this view was, for the first time in a scientific manner, presented in The Poverty of Philosophy, 1847 book, in which he harshly criticized Proudhon's views. We know that towards the end of his stay in Paris, in February 1845, Marx signed a contract with a publisher to publish his work, tentatively entitled A Critique of Politics and of Political Economy. This book was based on both economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 and his earlier manuscript contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of law. This plan did not materialize, and the contract was cancelled because Marx was busy writing other works and because of the fact that, again, in Marx's own words, the publisher was afraid of transactions with such revolutionary-minded author. Politically speaking, the next several years was probably one of the most active periods of Marx and Engels. Their participation in the revolutions of 1848, involving the establishment of the Communist League in June 1847, working on the Communist Manifesto on behalf of the League, and eventually publishing it in February 1848, just before the February Revolution in France, were some of the high points of the period. In this period, Marx and Engels were expelled from Belgium, France, and Germany because of their political activities. We know that Marx finally returned to his systematic studies on the political economy again in London in the 1850s. In London, working on Capital's scope and the content, he used many of his earlier works, including, for example, economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 and other texts never published in his lifetime. We may consider the Capital project actually began in 1850, when Marx settled in London and heavily concentrated on studying political economy in the British Library. Or we may think, as some others do, that it started with Grundrisse in 1857-58. Alternatively, we may even considered the publication of Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy in 1859 as a starting point. Independently of what date we choose, we should admit that Capital is an unfinished work, and Marx himself was only able to publish the first volume. The 1850s on, the next 25-30 years, Capital's both form and content were continuously revised. Because of these ongoing revisions, I think it is necessary to reflect on the relationship between Capital's changing plans and the content of all volumes that have reached us because of Engels's dedication to completing the project. By considering this relationship, we can decide on what parts of Marxist economic theory are complete and what parts need to be advanced so that this theory can be used to identify the most important aspects of contemporary capitalism. More importantly, it can also guide us for political practice. One of the most comprehensive early plans of Capital is the one drafted in 1857. This plan obviously does not directly correspond to the contents of any volumes of Capital that we know. As we mentioned earlier, only Volume 1 published by Marx and Volume 2 and Volume 3 published by Engels from the remaining manuscripts. What is considered as Volume 4 of Capital, the Theories of Surplus Value, was published by Kautsky after Engels' death. According to this early plan, Capital was going to be 6 volumes. The contents of these volumes are like this. The first volume was on Capital. Itself has 4 parts. The first part is Capital in general, the second part competition, and the third one credit system, and the fourth one share capital. The other volumes were planned as the second volume being on landed property, and the third one on wage labor, the fourth one on state, the fifth foreign trade, the sixth on world market. When we compare this 6-volume plan with the contents of the existing 3 volumes of Capital, we can see how much of this Capital project was completed by Marx, and how much of it after Marx's death was completed by first Engels and later by Kautsky. As one of the leading authorities on the structure of Capital, Roman Rozdolsky, pointed out that the content of the original Volume 1 on Capital is distributed in all 3 volumes. Land ownership is discussed in Volume 3, wage labor in Volume 1, and the world market and crises are only partly discussed in Volume 3. Volume on the state and volume on foreign trade, except some scattered remarks, were not written at all. Rozdolsky's book, The Making of Marxist Capital, states that in 14 years between September 1857 and April 1868, that is even after Capital's first volume was published, Marx made 14 different plans. For example, in a letter Marx wrote to Kugelmann on October 13, 1866, he mentioned the 3-volume, 4-book plan. According to this plan, the first book, Book 1, the process on production of capital, and the second, Book 2, the process of circulation of capital, was going to be included in the first volume of Capital, and the Book 3, structure of the process as a whole, and Book 4 on the history of theory were going to constitute the second and the third volumes of Capital. Notice that this 3-volume plan of 1866 was 9 years after the early plan of 1857, but before the publication of Volume 1 of Capital. And more importantly, was different from the content of Volume 2 and 3 published by Engels after Marx's death. According to Marx's agreement with the publishing house that printed the first volume of Capital in 1867, this 1866 plan also changed. It was decided to publish the second and third book as the second volume. So the current first volume, published in September 1867, consisted of only the first book. In another letter, Kugelmann, after the publication of Capital, written in July 11, 1868, Marx said the following. I'm directly quoting. The third volume will contain a separate and detailed chapter on the gentlemen of the vulgar economy. The third volume Marx was referring to, therefore, here is, of course, the fourth book on the history of theory, and much later was published as The Theories of Surplus Value by Kautsky, as I mentioned earlier. So the conclusion drawn from these changes and Marxist letters would be the following. Before the publication of Volume 1 of Capital, Marx considered adding Book 2, which was the process of circulation of capital, to Volume 1. However, once again, Marx changed his view due to the agreement with publisher after the publication of Volume 1. He agreed to publish the second and third books together as a second volume, and the so-called fourth book on history of theory as a third volume. Interestingly enough, this plan did not materialize either. Engels himself made the final change after Marx died and published the second and third books as the current second and third volumes of Capital. Contrary to popular belief, Marx did not say that the method of investigation he used in Capital was a brand new one. Instead, he plainly stated this. Let me directly quote from him. The method of analysis used in Capital was a method not previously applied to economic subjects. Also, clarifying this further, Marx pointed out that in the analysis of economic forms, neither microscopes nor chemical regions are of use. The force of abstraction must replace both. So, we can say that the method of analysis used in Capital is the method of abstraction. Moreover, Marx reminded us that not one, but two methods were used in Capital, and they were independent of each other. On this matter, in the preface to the second German edition of Capital, Volume 1, he said the following. The method of presentation must differ in form from that of inquiry. The latter, the method of investigation, as sometimes he called, has to appropriate the material in detail, to analyze its different forms of development, to trace out their inner connection. Only after this work is done can the actual movement be adequately described. If this is done successfully, if the life of the subject matter is ideally reflected as in a mirror, then it may appear as if we had before us a mere a priori construction. In the preface, Marx also commented on an article in Russian about the method of Capital. The author of that piece identified the method of investigation as severely realistic, and the method of presentation as reflecting the German dialectics. Marx criticized this view in two respects. First, in terms of his attachment to the Hegelian dialectical method, that is, German dialectics. Second, his use of the dialectical method exclusively as the method of presentation. Regarding his relation to the Hegelian dialectic, Marx was very clear. He said this, "My dialectic method is not only different from the Hegelian, but its direct opposite." And continued by adding this, "The mystifying side of Hegelian dialectic I criticized nearly 30 years ago. I here and there, however, in the chapter on the theory of value, coquetted with the modes of expression peculiar to him." Marx considered that with Hegelian dialectic as standing on its head. It must be turned right side up again if we would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. By this modification, we comprehend the existing state of things, at the same time also recognize the negation of that state and its inevitable breaking up. This also allows us to see every historically developed social form in movement and therefore takes into account its transient nature, its temporary existence. When dialectic is applied this way, it becomes critical and revolutionary. What I just quoted shows both the materialist character of Marxist dialectic and also how it is different from the Hegelian one. Moreover, The quote has Marx's response to the Russian author, who claimed that Marx used Hegelian dialectic exclusively as a method of presentation. Marx himself admitted the fact that in the chapter on the theory of value, he flirted with the modes of expression peculiar to Hegel. So Marx thought that the Russian author was partially right. The method of presentation, especially in the first parts of Capital, is dialectical. However, more importantly, I think, Marx also declared that he adopted a completely dialectical view when he utilized the abstraction as his method of research. Because as soon as we comprehend and affirmatively recognize the existing state of things, at the same time also we recognize the negation of the state, of its inevitable breaking up. Therefore, we argue that dialectic permeates both the method of research and the method of presentation throughout Capital. In a way, Capital is dialectic from top to bottom. We can now see how Marxist dialectic manifests itself in the initial chapter of Capital, both in the analysis of capitalism and in the presentation of the results of such investigation. In fact, the very first two sentences of Capital are examples of such use of dialectic. Directly quoting from the book, "The wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of a commodity." The first sentence conveys a result of an investigation that utilized abstraction as a method of inquiry. The object of this investigation was capitalism itself. An initial observation of capitalism as an immense accumulation of commodities identifies the very object of analysis as capitalism, which is in motion. Capitalism is literally busy in accumulating commodities. What is observed as wealth, therefore, is the manifestation of that accumulation which takes place in time. The next step is to go beyond that observation by abstracting various aspects of wealth so that its ideal representation, its unit, as a single commodity can be discovered. Only after that discovery, the results of the investigation can be presented. The second sentence explicitly conveys the first step of Marx's presentation, the analysis of a commodity. What happens after the first step? We move from the abstract category of a commodity, deduced by abstraction from directly observable concrete wealth, to the dual aspects of commodity, use value and exchange value. Identification of these two aspects of a commodity becomes a critical presentational device that Marx uses throughout Capital. First, moving from universal or general to historically specific, like in the case of use value in itself as universal and applicable to all societies, and use value with exchange value as unique to capitalism. Second, in arriving at a newer notion as a resolution of the initial duality itself, like in the case of capitalistically produced commodity with its use value and exchange value aspects, leads us to the notion of value. As Marx pointed out, the emphasis on the twofold nature of things should not be seen as only a presentational device. His dialectical perspective led him to discover in his inquiry, for example, the twofold nature of labor, concrete labor related to use value, and abstract labor related to exchange value, and then to value. Let us see how Marx explained this process. Directly quoting, again, from him, "At first sight, a commodity presented itself to us as a complex of two things, use value and exchange value. Later on, we saw also that labor too possesses the same twofold nature. For so far as it finds expression in value, it does not possess the same characteristics that belong to it as a creator of use values. I was the first to point out, to examine critically this twofold nature of the labor contained in commodities. Therefore, we should be clear about this. Capital must be read and understood as an analysis of capitalism based on the dialectical relationship of the universal and specific. Marx steadily introduces various concepts of natural law at the universal level and then moves to the categories specific to capitalism. We will see this repeatedly when we move from product to commodity, from use value to exchange value, from concrete labor to abstract labor, from the labor process to valorization process, etc., etc. Be ready, enjoy reading Capital, and more importantly, use it to change capitalism.